those wars to figure out who was responsible for these wars. Obviously, in the time allotted us this evening, and even if we had a week's time, it would be impossible to go through all of his findings. But what I can do is, I can quote to you his conclusions, which are pretty short. Now bear in mind, as I quote these conclusions, these are not the findings of one person, Mr. Maoz. No, he is telling you what all the historians in the field of Middle East studies, what they now conclude. So this is what he finds. Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. Not one of the wars Israel has fought, with the possible exception of the 1948 war, not one was a war of self-defense. They were all wars of choice or folly. Folly means stupidity. Wars of choice or folly. But bear in mind, not one of the wars, with the possible exception of 48, according to Mr. Maoz, having read through all of the scholarship, not one was a war of necessity. That's the war side. But what about the peace side? So many wars. Who is responsible for the lack, after all these wars, of peace? Who is blocking the peace? Israel's former foreign minister, a very smart man named Abba Eben, he famously said that the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. And a lot of commentators like to quote that phrase. It is very clever. The Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. It's very clever. And he was a very clever man. The problem is, like most of his clever statements, they had very little to do with reality. So what does Mr. Maoz find? Reading through all of the scholarly literature, he concludes, and now I'm quoting him, Israel's decision makers were as reluctant when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger-happy when it came to making war. The Israeli leaders typically did not initiate peace overtures, peace proposals. Most of the peace proposals in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, the international community, or from local organizations. And then he goes on to say, when Israel was willing to take risks for peace, these usually paid off. The Arabs generally showed a remarkable tendency to agree, to accept, to fulfill their treaty obligations. In quite a few cases, it was Israel, rather than the Arabs, that violated the agreements. It's an interesting insight, because we're often told, how can you trust the Arabs if Israel signs an agreement? How can Israel trust the Arabs to fulfill their obligations under the agreement? But Mr. Ma'az says, that's the wrong question. The Arabs have generally shown a remarkable tendency to fulfill their treaty obligations. It's Israel that's violated the agreements. So looking at the actual record, the rational question would be, how can the Arabs trust that Israel will fulfill its obligations if it signs an agreement? That's the historical aspect of the record. Again, I'm trying to limit myself to what are alleged to be the most controversial issues: the refugees, the war, and the peace. If you look at the present, the most significant aspect of the present situation is obviously the human rights issues. As the video demonstrated, most of the media is preoccupied with the death and the destruction, because that's what makes the news. And we're often told that what's going on in the occupied territories, it's very controversial. It's very hard to know what's going on there. And so typically what happens, at any rate in the North American press and media, a reporter goes to the occupied territories. He asks the Israelis what happened. The Israelis say X happened. He then asks the Palestinians what happened. The Palestinians say negative X happened. And then the reporter throws his hands in the air in despair and says, who knows what happened? It's very controversial. But the odd thing is that never happens anywhere else in the world. Because anywhere else in the world, they don't ask the victim what happened. They don't ask the perpetrator what happened, because everybody expects, reasonably so, that the victim has a bias as the victim, and the perpetrator has a bias as the perpetrator. So you don't ask the victim, you don't ask the perpetrator. Everywhere else in the world, you go to the local human rights organization or the local representative of an international human rights organization. So you want to know what happened in the Balkans, or what happened in Sudan, or what happened in Somalia, or what happened in the Congo. Typically, they will interview a representative of a local human rights organization, or they will ask a representative of Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International what happened.